rise of the warrior cop. He thinks so, but he thinks that even in America, there are concerns over this ever-growing trend.
The Army itself, actually, in a newsletter a few months ago, recommended against using MRAPs even at U.S. military bases. You know, on paved streets in the United States, they're actually unsafe. They tear up the streets. They have a high rollover potential.
We have those vehicles here in Australian police forces. We're going to look closer at the khakiying of our boys and girls in blue. That's coming up next.
Down the block, water bottles are flying through the air. It's totally dissolved. The night had been ending peacefully. The night was ending peacefully. They're putting a man down to the ground. They've got a man down on the ground in front of me. They're arresting him right in front of me. They need to tell us to back up. Trying to push us all back. The militarized police are out here again. They obviously are having a problem because the protesters are mixed in with the media. The protesters are mixed in with us. What a shame, because this night was ending peacefully, and then this happened.
Police with assault rifles, police in body armour, police in gas masks, tumbling out of armoured cars, police in camouflage, police who look for all the world like soldiers. Anyone watching the coverage of the ongoing mayhem in Ferguson, Missouri over the past week or so could have been forgiven for thinking that maybe the Army had taken charge. Militarisation of police forces has become something of a talking point. It's a subject that might ring a few Australian bells too. Why do police need high-powered automatic weaponry and armoured cars? Why do Australian police need these things? When did the paradigm of policing shift from truncheons to machine guns? Terry Goldsworthy is a former detective and assistant professor of criminology at Queensland's Bond University. Rob Starry is a Melbourne criminal defence lawyer. And Jude McCulloch is the author of Blue Army and professor of criminology at Melbourne's Monash University. They join you now. Welcome.
Hello. Welcome.
Thank you. Was there a moment, Terry Goldsworthy, when everything changed for policing? I'm sensing a link with national security, the war on terror.
Yeah, look, I think that we went from a fairly relaxed approach to dealing with armed offenders. When I was a young detective, we would do our own raids on armed robbers. Prior to me leaving the service a couple of years ago, that was unthinkable. Once there was mention of a firearm, even if it was only suspicion, we would have to engage the heavily armed specialist units. So I think over the last few years, probably the last 10 or so, we've seen that move towards risk mitigation for injury to people, and you have the heavily armed, specialised, well-trained small groups going out and doing those types of raids. So I think it's been a gradual thing. Certainly the war on terror has boosted funding for those types of units, there's no doubt of that.
Jude, in what we've been watching in Ferguson, there are Australian sort of correlations. Is it just as Terry suggests, there is sort of an occupational health and safety issue, or is there something more there in the way that police forces are viewing the world?
Look, there's a real parallel, and there's a convergence in the way that policing is being done in the US, the UK and Australia. And there was a precise time in Australia where the line between the military and police, which had formerly been very clear, began to blur. And that was in the late to mid-1970s. The Fraser government announced that there would be specialist paramilitary units in police forces around Australia on the grounds that they were needed to counter terrorism. And this was announced after the Hilton bombing.
Right.
However, the program to establish those units, which would train with the military, have a military ethos and have military equipment, was done in secret before the Hilton bombing. And that was just the pretext for announcing it.
Which 40 years ago was perhaps not even a shadow of what we see now in Australian policing.
No, so what's happened is over the last few decades, even though these units were set up to be used only in extreme cases like counter-terrorism, what in fact happened is they've been normalised into everyday policing. The ethos, the culture, the equipment, the tactics has been integrated over time into everyday policing. And the reason that I started investigating paramilitary policing in Australia in the 1990s, because there was a sharp spike in fatal shootings by Victoria Police at the time. And so I really disagree with Terry, because what my research showed was that those fatal shootings of citizens in Victoria were a direct result of the influence of paramilitary policing. I don't think it's a matter of, having well-trained people doing things in an expert way. I think it's very much a clash of values between policing, which is about dealing with citizens who've committed crimes, and proactive military-style tactics, which were about dealing with enemies and eliminating them.
How do we see that, Rob Starry, on the ground, in the way in which people who attract the attention of police encounter police? What's the sort of police culture that they're encountering now?
Well, I think I agree generally with what Jude has said, that with those dedicated squads, that they're there for a particular purpose. They're well equipped, they want to be utilised, and they resort to the use of their weaponry much more readily. And it's accelerated certainly post 9/11 with the normalisation of the use of that sort of weaponry. For instance, capsicum spray. Every police officer now has capsicum spray with them. And
a good thing as an alternative to a firearm, potentially.
Sure, if it's used as a genuine alternative to lethal force, yes it is, but it's not. It's used almost invariably in most violent arrests, whether there's weapons used by the offender or not. But I'm more concerned, for instance, about how those sorts of units are now used, and there's been a proliferation of them, have been used to suppress dissent, both industrially and politically, particularly with the student movement.
There's a lot of fairly tough equipment, Terry Goldsworthy, is there not? I mean, we've seen some of this in the American context, but I think listeners might be surprised at the sort of resources that are available to special squads and more generally in policing in Australia.
Yeah, look, I think you need to make a differentiation here between the specialist squads and generalised policing. To say that all police are militarised is simply inaccurate. When I was in the police up to a couple of years ago, we did firearm training twice a year, if we were lucky. My staff, who were detectives, didn't go out with the military ethos and conduct their search warrants and investigations. These specialist units are quite separate and distinct from the general duties police officer you'll see on the road. They are used in high threat situations. Talking about industrial protests and things like that, you simply wouldn't see, well, at least in Queensland, you wouldn't see the Special Emergency Response Team being used in that kind of scenario. What you would see
Terry,
is...
would they use armoured vehicles, for instance? Would they have laser guns with them? Would they have capsicum spray? Would they have extendable batons? Would they be armed with that sort of equipment?
No, you wouldn't see the armoured vehicle being used for an industrial protest. You'd see general duty officers there. You may see the Public Safety Response Team, which is a unit that is specialist trained to deal with large riot situations. They would have capsicum spray. They would have extendable batons. They are all part of their non-lethal use of force model that they have, which can be raised or decreased depending on the threat level. So when you're talking about use of force, you have to consider things such as what is the threat, who is the threat, and what is the proportionality to the force you're proposing to use and the force that is being used against you.
It can play out rather menacingly. This again from Ferguson.
In the military, we're trained on something called escalation of force, which basically means the only time that you're really going to point a weapon directly at someone is when you're ready to pull the trigger. And instead of that, we've seen in Ferguson that police are just wandering around with their weapons up at all times, pointing them at people that obviously didn't pose a threat.
This, I think, Jude, in this context of militarisation, I mean, it goes to the training, it goes to the capacity of police forces to use resources that they may suddenly have access to. Is there reason for concern there?
I think there's real reason for concern. In Australia, paramilitary police, at least in Victoria, have definitely been used to train police involved in public order policing. I do think that their influence spreads beyond just those high force and high risk activities, but to policing. And there is a real concern about the attitude of police, the ramping up of the weaponry, seeing citizens as potential enemies. I think what that grab that you took from the American situation tends to show is they've got military weapons but not military discipline, which can mean you've got the worst of both worlds.
Sunday Extra here on RN, we're talking about this rather vexing and very topical issue of police militarisation with Terry Goldsworthy, Rob Starry and Jude McCulloch. Rob, this to some extent goes to the very nature of policing and how that's changing. I mean, the traditional thing of a sworn officer, the public servant protecting the community, that's a rather different role to somebody done up in the camouflage gear holding an automatic weapon.
Yeah, full riot gear. And there's no better domestic example of that in, for instance, the G20 protests, the APEC protests, and World Youth Day, for instance, where they establish exclusion zones, where they physically prevent people exercising their right of protest or exercising their right of assembly.
Which in some senses are probably, best practice in some sort of view of crowd control to take those sorts of tactics.
Yeah, but we look at what happened in Melbourne in the G20 protest. I think Peter Casella at the time described it as the worst riot in the history of the country, and that there would be no economic program or congress in Australia ever again. And of course that proved to be wrong several times over. But my disquiet really arises out of not just the use of the military, the militarisation of the police force in those sorts of contexts, particularly where it's designed to suppress dissent, but the adaptation of terrorism laws where there are association offences, where there are the use of well-armed, well-equipped police officers to, for instance, raid motorcycle gangs where there's no obvious use of weaponry. I get troubled by all of that and how that might be extended and then extended into an industrial context.
There's a lot of things coming together at one point, aren't there?
Correct. Yeah.
And Terry, Rob there mentions the G20 protest back in Melbourne. We're looking at G20 meeting in Brisbane coming up. Presumably that will involve special squads, the full gamut of paramilitary policing in a protective sense there.
Oh, look, certainly it will. If you look at the restricted areas where you have the heads of state staying and that, they will be in full lockdown. So there will be, I suspect, drawing on other services throughout Australia, perhaps even military, to protect them from the highest level threat, that being terrorism. Stepping back from that, you have the declared area, which is a wider part of Brisbane City and some outlying areas where people will be allowed in. It is not a exclusion zone. You can actually go in there. There'll be no physical barriers, but there are special powers the police will have that will apply within there. You can protest in there, but the police are asking that you register the protest with them so they know who's going to protest. You don't need a licence within that area. It's governed by the G20 Act. So they're trying to do a balancing act, I guess, and looking after security of these protected dignitaries who are internationally protected persons. There's about 36 or 35 coming out, and then also allowing for the, no doubt, the protests that will take place about a number of social issues that there's discord out there about.
I mean, Jude, it's an interesting expansion of the role in a way of policing to take on that sort of responsibility around things like the G20.
Well, I think what we see in that space of the G20, and we saw it at the Sydney Olympics in 2002, is you see a bringing together of police and military personnel, the military taking part in civil activities alongside the police. And it is a dangerous creep that we're going through. There has always been, in Australia, part of our constitutional tradition to have a strict division between the police and the military because they do have different ethoses. Countries like Indonesia, of course, have always had the military more involved in civilian activities, but it's a different sort of situation. So I don't take the same relaxed attitude towards it. I think it's something that is about the fundamental nature of our democracy, where the right to protest is a really important part of a vibrant democracy. And I think what Rob was saying about a heavy-handed nature of the control of dissent, it has a chilling effect.
I think we saw that in the various Occupy movements. They might have been a social nuisance in terms of occupying various public areas, but nothing more than that. No suggestion of any violent behaviour. And yet, when it came to the removal of those persons, there was a very heavy-handed approach.
Has the nature of that protest changed? I mean, is the nature of the threat, as it might be perceived by police, changed in those situations?
I'm concerned. Terry talked about this balancing act, and there's a right to protest will be preserved, but it's certainly confined and it's certainly curtailed. and the state will monitor every aspect of that right to protest.
And Jude, beyond that awkward balance that you refer to there of the military and the police, we have an extra layer too of private security now, which is taking an increasing role in a variety of situations.
Yeah, and that really does complicate a whole lot of things, particularly public accountability. And we've seen that, for example, at Manus Island, where it's very difficult to see who's responsible and everyone washes their hands of problems. So,
and then the private provider claims commercial in confidence and won't reveal anything. So they're completely obstructive to investigation. There's no transparency or accountability.
Where at least, Terry, the police officer is sworn to a public duty to protect.
Well, that's right. If you look at the use of security within the G20 area, I guess, they'll be performing roles such as, static security for people going in and out of a building, etc., things like that. They have no powers to make arrests, etc. The same as the Defence Force personnel won't be sworn in, to my knowledge, as special constables. So they have no power under the Police Power Responsibilities Act to effect arrests and things like that. That will be the role of police. And that's the reason we have 5,000 police coming to G20. We have some police from the state coming in. They will be sworn in as special constables and have most of the powers that a normal Queensland police officer will have.
Because, Jude, just to finish, we place great faith in that relationship between a community and its police force. They are sworn to protect us. That's fundamental.
yeah, and I think it's important that policing is done by police, not the military, and they're preferable to private security. But I think it's important to keep the ethos, and there's a tension there between community policing and paramilitary policing. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum. When Victoria pulled back from its paramilitary policing model in the mid-1990s, the number of fatal shootings went down. And part of the reason why that happened, because we got a new Chief Commissioner early 2000 who was committed to community policing, and in some respects that made a difference. So I think it's important to maintain that ethos of the idea of police as beholden, part of the community, protectors of the community, rather than the military, who are a repressive force dealing with enemies.
Good note to end, and an important distinction. Look, thanks to all three our guests this morning. Terry Goldsworthy, Assistant Professor of Criminology at Queensland's Bond University; Rob Starry, Melbourne criminal defence lawyer; and Jude McCulloch, author of the book Blue Army, Professor of Criminology at Melbourne's Monash University. This is Sunday Extra, Your Honour.
Okay, well, the rise of the warrior cop. I personally don't believe police officers should be issued with a firearm and a bulletproof flak jacket. They can have one or the other, but I don't see why in a disarmed society our state police are expected to wander around with a flak jacket and a 16-shot semi-automatic sidearm. The sidearm is issued so they can shoot back at anybody after a possible miscreant has fired at the police, and that means they get to hide behind the hole in the muzzle the bullet comes out. That is their small circular shield, and the word for a small circular shield is a target. If they don't want to hide behind the target, which is what the muzzle is, then they should be issued with a flak jacket. But bear in mind, it is not possible for any individual to remain employed within the security industry unless that individual is, ipso facto per se, fundamentally psychiatrically insecure. Anybody who's not insecure just can't see the point. Because the actual incidence of the terrible events that the security industry is devoted to protect against is so infinitesimally small that it's not worth devoting the resources that they throw at attempting to prevent it. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.